Hi everyone, and welcome to video part 5, which I'm actually going to split into two videos. There'll be 5A and 5B, about rendering your final scene assignment inside 3D Studio Max. So let's say that you have your scene done, and I'm going to create a quick scene here. You should have a barn, you should have a silo of some sort, and you should have an alien ship with a tractor beam. I created it simply with different shapes here to give you just a sample of what you should be rendering. It doesn't matter if you want to render everything in an isometric view, this view, that view, just wherever the polygons are visible. Try not to catch any invisible polygons. Just have something simple like this set up that we can render. And I'll put a little something in the tractor beam. Like that. So if we have our scene set up, where we're going to focus a lot of our attention today is going to the rendering panel inside 3D Studio Max. So if we go to the rendering panel in the very top, in our toolbar at the very top, we have a rendering bar. In this rendering bar, you see we can just render out our scene as is by clicking the render button right here at the very top, or pushing Shift and Q as a hotkey. If I do that, I get this. Now, it doesn't look very good right now. It's still a square image format, very old school format, low resolution, no detail. You can't really pick anything out, and nothing really looks that great. That's okay, because this is the default rendering inside 3D Studio Max, and we're going to change a bunch of things to make sure that we get rendering looking as good as we want. You can also use these renders inside of Photoshop if you want, and render out different layers so that you can modify your scene in Photoshop to make it look even prettier. So if you are a Photoshop junkie, then this is where you're about to shine probably. If you click on rendering, you see that we not only have render, we have render in the cloud. So if you have you can actually use render services to render out in 3D Studio Max. You can open up the Autodesk gallery to view renders. But where we want to focus our attention on is actually render setup right now. Render setup allows you to change the properties of your rendering. And that includes pushing F10. You can open up this window as well and change a bunch of different things inside of 3D Studio Max. So when you click on rendering render setup, you'll get this bar that pops up. And you can extend it just ever slightly so we can see more of the bar if you can, just the very bottom. And we can see that we have target. Is it production, iteration, active shave? We're going to leave this on production mode. This is basically telling 3D Studio Max you're about to produce, you're saving this out. The renderer, what renderer are we using? So the basic renderer inside 3D Studio Max is what's called a scanline renderer. You've probably heard of different renderers online. Normally Pixar will make a new type of renderer for their movies. And that's exactly where they would switch that type of renderer. Right now we have Skyline renderer, but you can see we have Quicksilver, ART, View, iRay, and Mental Ray. Mental Ray is a very popular 3D Studio Max renderer, but we're just going to use the basic Scanline renderer for now, just so that we can send off images, this image relatively fast so that we can work with it. And that's pretty much it. And we can see what view to render. So right now we're going to view it from our Quad 4 perspective. In our render settings, just like everything else in 3D Studio Max, we get a lot of different parameters here. So these parameters tell us exactly what we're going to save out. In common parameters, you see time output. And this is explaining to you that you're going to render out a single image right now. However, there's also active time segment and range and frames. So you can render out multiple frames if you're doing some in animation, and range and active are all for animation. However, single is just for one straight image, and that's what we're going to focus on right now. Area to render, you probably want to render the view, but you can also change what area that you want to render inside your scene. Output size is where it's going to become the most important, because output size determines what your image is going to render out to be. Currently, it's set to custom with a width of 640 by 480. You can see we have different settings, and we can change the aperture width. We can also change the resolution of the image, 320 by 240, 720 486, 800 by 600, etc. And we can also change the image aspect and the pixel aspect. However, sometimes playing around with these settings, you don't really know what type of image you want. It's always good to go bigger because you can always scale down in a different program like Photoshop. So don't fret around too much with the low numbers. We're going to click on custom, and you can see it actually has a lot of default settings for you to use, which is 35 millimeter cine cameras, so more for cinema. anamorphic cameras, Panavision cameras, even has a 70 millimeter IMAX camera built right in here. VistaVision 35 millimeter for slides, for basic video, for PAL and NTSC video. But we also have HDTV. HDTV is where we want to keep our files because basically it gives you all the default HDTV resolutions right here. 1920 by 1080, 480 by 270. So you don't have to fiddle around too much with realizing that this is how your image is going to save out to a TV screen, sort of at a default state. You can also change the options of your render. You can see here that we have atmospherics, effects, and displacement on, but we can change exactly what renders and what doesn't render. But currently, this is our default setting. We also have things like using advanced lighting, which is already on. We're just going to leave these as default. Most of these I will leave on to default. We have email notifications. If you do a render, it will actually notify you if a render is done. If you set up your email settings in here, if you make a render of an animation, you can actually have it email you when your render is done. So if you're out getting a snack, it'll be like render is done and send you an email, which is pretty interesting. It's a nice feature. So now that we've set our output size to HDTV, and it should be 1920 by 1080 or whatever resolution you want, I want you to click inside your perspective view right now, and you can hit Shift Q again. And now you can see we get a much bigger render of what we're looking at, which is fantastic. Obviously, it's a much bigger image to work with. Anything that's in black currently inside 3D Studio Max is actually transparent. And you can click through the different alpha channels here to see what's rendering and what won't. This is an alpha channel, kind of like how Photoshop would view an alpha channel. The white is considered visible, the black is considered invisible, and anything gray or in between means it's semi-transparent. So you can see, because I changed the visibility of my my ray here coming from the alien ship, my tractor beam, it's actually semi-transparent also in the alpha layer, which is great. That's exactly what we want. Or you can go see the color layers, red, green, and blue. You can see it in monochrome if you have color blindness or anything like that. You can switch it to monochrome to see how it would look for people with color blindness. And then we can always save out our image. It's easy enough to save out an image, and we're just saving out this quick image just as an example. We can just click the little disk icon in the top left where it says Save Image, and we can click Save Image and save it anywhere we want. And I can save it to my desktop as any format I want and any file name. I'll just name this Quick Farm. Now, if you want to have the transparent black in the background, you need to save it as a PNG or a Targa file. JPEGs don't handle transparency, so I'm going to save it as a PNG file. And when you click Save, so I call it Quick Farm, it's a PNG image file, and I click Save to my desktop, you'll notice a little menu pops up and asks you, do you want that alpha channel? Of course I want that alpha channel. What kind of colors do you want? RGB 48-bit is good for me. 281 trillion colors going strong. And then you click OK, and you should have your image saved to your desktop. My apologies for all this. There you go. And you can see that it rendered out this part of my image, and all that black is now gone. Everything is transparent, and if I bring it into a program like Photoshop, we're good to go to create our own background. We can paint in our own sky and stuff like that. So you'll find actually that the use for creating basic 3D objects is high in demand. Especially when it comes to the comic book industry, the graphic industry, because what they'll do is they'll actually save renders like let's say like this as basic concepts or sketches, and you'll draw over it in Photoshop. It's a good practice to have, because imagine, if you will, we just needed this building. If you were going to try out try and draw a perfect building like this, it might be rather difficult without using shortcuts inside Photoshop. But if we make a building that's very detailed, and add in a lot of that, and then render it out, and then put it into our scene, it makes it so much easier inside Photoshop to actually paint a comic book or a scene or anything like that. And so that's actually very common practice nowadays. In fact, if you want to look up a great example of that, please do so. It's, I believe, one of the first Iron Man Extremis comics was one of the first where the comic book artist admitted to buying a 3D model of Iron Man and using it in the comic book. He would render it out, he would draw on top of it, and that would be that. So it makes a lot of sense, because if one 3D model of Iron Man you can use in a 25-page comic book, it's much easier than drawing him out perfectly every time from different angles. So just be aware that rendering with transparencies is very useful and very helpful. Excuse me, very helpful. And this is also another reason why we need to get used to doing the layers. So for instance, if I wanted to make a layer, I would go to my layer and scene manager over here. I'd make sure I'm sort by layer, and I grab every part of my alien picking up this object. And I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call it alien. So what I can do with this is I can actually hide the alien layer and just render the background layer. So I'm going to push Shift Q and I'm going to render just my background. So I'm going to call this one BG and PNG. And then I'm going to turn off my background layer and just put my alien layer in. And I'm going to save this desktop as PNG alien. And now if I bring these into Photoshop, I have layers of things I can work on. Background and alien. And now I can put them into Photoshop on top of each other. And now I can work with just the alien layer, just the background layer. And you can break that down even further and separate those boxes in different pieces, etc., etc. So now that we talked a little bit about rendering and just changing the render setup for that, we can do a couple of other small things. We can push rendering up top here, and we can go down to environment. So the environment button, once clicked, you'll notice that when we were rendering, there was a black background. Well, here we can actually change that black background just by clicking the black color here, and I can change it to, let's say, gray. And now if I push Shift Q, I can see a gray background. Or this is just for a color comparison point. So if you want to, if you know that your scene is going to have like a very dark mood of, let's say, a little darker, like a little blue in the background, you would render this out. Now, the blue we still have in the background will be transparent, but if you save it as a JPEG or a different file type, it will actually render out the blue. If you render out a video, it actually renders out the color in the background, not transparent. So those are just things you need to be aware of as you're rendering. So pushing 8 on the keyboard to open up, excuse me, environment and effects, or going to the rendering menu and clicking environment will bring this up and allow you to change the color. You can also load in images and use an environment map. So you can load an image here by clicking none, and you can select any of the pre-images that Max has available for you, or you can click on bitmap and load your own image from your computer. So for instance, I'll load in just this random skin, for instance. And you can see it says use map number 0, and the texture name here. If I push Shift Q now, it renders out that background map, that texture, and then I have this. And you can also turn that on and off by using use map, by clicking use map, and you can see it goes back to the color. So if you want to use an image rendered in the background, I'd highly suggest to paint an image that's 1920 by 1080, or if that's your camera resolution, and then you can actually render it in the background as you're playing around with your scene. There's also exposure control and atmospheric effects that we can add. We'll worry about those a little bit later, but for now I just want you to focus that if you're modeling something in 3D Studio Max that's, let's say, black, you can't really have a black background. You probably want to lighten it up a bit by turning it to a gray or turning it to a white so you can see everything a little clearer. So if I make this white, you can see I get a nice bright white, and then I can really see my alien holding the object in the air. So that's about just rendering with the camera. Getting used to pushing Shift Q to do quick renders and changing a render setup to match what you need to render is the first steps to creating nice renders. The second step is actually playing around with cameras and lights, which we're going to go through right now. This is just a quick example of how to set up cameras and lights so that you can do a nice little setup for your alien scene. Really, I'm going to take a look around in 3D Studio Max at your scene, but these renders will help get you a visual style for how things will look for you if you were going to do an advertisement, let's say, or a poster, or share these renders with other people, because I know you're going to want to start doing that very soon. So the first thing we're going to go to is cameras. If you go in your create panel here, you'll notice we have geometry, shapes, lights, and cameras. So we're going to go to lights, and then I'm going to switch over to cameras. I just like switching between both just to sort of see what I have available to me. If I go to cameras and standard, we have several different cameras: physical, target, and free. Target camera is normally the one you want the most. Target camera works. You can left click on target. Target mode is now active. You can left click anywhere in your scene and create a camera and point it to wherever you want. So I just left click and drag, and now I have my camera pointing there. There are two parts to a camera when it's created. You'll notice in the left-hand side, I'll drag this out of my alien layer into my 0 default layer. I have camera 001 and camera 001 target. Now, camera 001, which I'll make visible right now, camera 001 is this right here, and it's the actual physical camera that is looking in a certain direction. Camera 001 target is the actual point that it's trying to look at in your scene. So although your camera is looking in a direction, the closer the point is to your camera, you can see how the lens is looking at the scene here, like that. So you have to play around with both to get the right view. Now, this might be a bit confusing because you're playing around with the camera, and it's like, okay, you can play around as much as you want, but you're never going to get it perfect because you just don't know how this camera is seeing the scene. It's like, okay, I think this looks good, but I'm pushing Shift Q, and it's not rendering how I want. That's because it's not rendering from the proper view. It's rendering just a viewport right here. It's not rendering from a camera. And I'm like, okay, well, how do I change this? I can't. I don't know how to change this. The easiest thing to do is when you create a camera inside 3D Studio Max, you need to go to rendering, and you go to render setup. So pushing F10 on your keyboard again can go here as well. With this open, and with restoring viewports to this, we can change one of our cameras one of our viewports. If we click on top, front, left, or perspective, whichever one, we can actually change this to camera 001 now. You'll notice that there's now, like with this arrow here beside cameras, it now opens camera 001 as another type of viewport you can have. And if I click that, I'm actually seeing from the perspective of the camera. And if I move, you can see that camera move. If I rotate, oops. If I rotate, sorry about that. If I rotate, move, I can zoom in. Now, you're going to notice something. I can pan the camera with my middle mouse button, but I can't rotate or zoom. The tools are a little bit different now inside the camera mode. That's fine. This is where we learn to use another part of 3D Studio Max. And these are down here. These control cameras. Truck camera, orbit camera, and roll camera. So all your camera settings in that viewport, if I click between viewports, it actually changes the bottom right menu of 3D Studio Max. At the very bottom right, you can see those icons change. And with these changing icons, we can actually change how that camera is going to look at the scene. I can use my truck. I can use my field of view to change the field of view of the camera. I can use my orbit right there. I can roll the camera. And you can see the camera rolling in the different scene. Change the perspective of the camera. So if you ever noticed in a movie that sometimes the camera looks like it's zooming in on a character, but the background is kind of manipulating as well, that's actually this perspective trick. Everything is the same, it's just how close the camera is to the point that changes. Look as the camera gets closer, how different the perspective of your 3D objects looks. It gives it a much different feel as you're playing around. For instance, if I go here and I'm looking at your scene, and this is kind of how playing your scene might look. You just have the alien ship and kind of the silo and the farm. But if I play around with the perspective, left click here and it's on perspective mode, we get this nice, weirdly alien-looking scene where the UFO is a little too close, the silo and the barn are a little in the background there. It makes a really interesting thing. So don't forget to play around with things like perspective, maybe add a slight camera roll, make it a little unsettling at an angle. You can dolly the camera so you can zoom in and zoom out here. All your camera tools are at the bottom right down there. So set up your camera however you feel like you want to set it up to create an interesting render. And don't be afraid to change where your objects are in your scene to match that as well. I love playing with the perspective tool. I think it adds a lot of uniqueness to renders and makes them actually like tell a story. Like, is it more haunting? Is it more scary or kooky and crazy? Tim Burton does a lot of perspective tricks. Even Quentin Tarantino does a lot of perspective camera tricks where the background will kind of feel like it's pushing in and the characters look like they're going into the background. Just these little camera tricks allow you to do quite a bit. You can also change the camera properties by clicking on the camera and changing what type of lens you want. 15 millimeter, 20 millimeter, 24. You can see the different millimeter stock lenses that are available. Change how you're seeing your scene. You can change the lens type here. You can change the field of view here. You can show the cone. You can show the horizon line. You can show the environment range. So that's how much of the environment it picks up inside your camera. Um, clipping plane. So if you want to clip out some of the background that's too far past a certain point, you can actually clip out the rendering of certain things, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long little list of things you can do here. So now that we have this, we can actually render right from our camera. I'm clicking in my camera viewport. I just clicked Shift Q inside my camera viewport, and we see we're rendering from camera 001 now. So camera 001. And it's saying that we're looking at camera 001 in the quad 4 viewport right here, which is great. You're going to notice something as well that you might see. If I have my viewport this size, watch what happens. It's the same exact render. It didn't change my render based on my viewport size. It's actually rendering 1920 by 1080, even if it's outside this viewport range. The reason why it does that is because of a thing called safe frames. Safe frames shows you where in your viewport your scene is going to render. If you click on camera 001 or front or left or perspective, anywhere in that, if you scroll down, you're going to see that you can push Shift and F or click on this button called Show Safe Frames or Shift F, and it will show you how it's going to render this scene. And you can see that safe frame is always contained to that 1920 by 1080 resolution inside your scene. So keeping safe frames on while one of your viewports is in camera mode is especially important because that's actually how your frame is going to render. And if you can manipulate the camera to make it work in your favor, like there's a cool view. I like this view a lot. You can see the alien ship. Oops. Shift Q while this scene is selected. This viewport is selected. Alien ship taking the object. Barn there. Silo there. That's a really unique view on how to see things. So just by having safe frames on, playing around with the different modes, including perspective, the camera roll, and everything like that, we get a very unique look to our scene. Even though it's really low polygon, once we put our high detail models in there that look really good, making that render is going to look really nice. So now that your camera is set up in the right location, you've rolled it, you moved it, you adjusted it, you dollied it, trucked it, zoomed it, everything. You did a little bit of everything. You bopped it. Our camera is set up in the right location. Now we want to play around with light sources. So to play around with light sources is as simple as going to lights and going to standard lights. So we're going to play around with standard lights right now. If you know a little bit about lighting, then that's great. But lighting is a bit of a tricky situation because lighting is actually a whole career on itself. Modeling is one career. Lighting is a whole different career, and it can be very difficult. Normally, the scenes that you see in Pixar movies follow. They usually have about 70 lights in them, but there's always a standard to lighting. There's always a front light, a back light, and a type of perspective light. So you light something from the front, just a little bit so you can see it clearly. You light something from the back so it forms kind of a rim in the middle of the character, and you put another light at a more like a 3/4 angle, so you have and make it very, very soft. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some spotlights. I'm going to add one spotlight just by clicking on target spot. And I'm going to left click and drag here. So there's one big spotlight in the scene. If you want to see what the spotlight in the scene looks like really quick, we can change our viewport mode to high quality. And you can see it's casting shadows. What you're going to see though when you render this is these shadows here in the back, like that. But it's not really perfect, right? We need to start playing around with our scene a little bit more. I'm going to change the environment. Since it'll probably be nighttime, give it that mood. I'm going to change it to a very gray and maybe a dark blue type setting. Blue, like this. And I'm going to make a plane for the ground. I'll go to my top view here. And I'll make this green. There you go. So what you're going to notice is that there's certain things that aren't showing up really well. If I turn my camera 001 to high quality, and I'm going to turn off G. I'm going to turn off the grid. What you can start seeing here is that the ground is not lit up, and that's because the spotlight is facing our main objects and not towards the ground. So if I do this to spotlight those, I need to make sure that other lights are in that scene to kind of highlight everything else a little bit sharper. If you go to the parameters in target spot, you can actually change how things appear as well. Everything in 3D Studio Max has parameters. So if we have our spotlight, we go to our modify panel, we go to target spot, and we can see we have light type. We can have a directional light, which lights everything in a certain direction. We have spotlight. We have an omni light, which is more like an all-around light. You can see it's even trying to calculate it here. So we have an all-around light source, which might be interesting if we want to do like an alien render, like we have this light underneath. Just by changing that light type to an omni light and placing it underneath the alien, we're creating a type of mood for the scene that we have. So I'm creating an omni light. I'm putting it right here under the alien part. I'm going to change this tractor beam to like a green type effect. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this omni light. I'm going to move it to the sky. So the one thing you're probably asking yourself is that omni light looks like it's green. Well, it's actually not green. These lights actually have color, intensity, and attunement. So if I click on here, you'll see that our lights are actually white. These two lights, these two omnis, this one and that one, they're both 1, which is 100% full white color. And we can actually change this number to go higher or lower. So if you want this super bright, you can increase it up to like, I believe 100. Yeah, super bright. Look at that. Or we can go down to 1, or we can go to 0.2. We can create soft lights with this. So I'm going to create a really soft omni light up here, maybe 0.5. I'm going to make it blue. And then I'm going to make sure that this omni light looks green. So my tractor beam has a very green light at maybe 0.4. And I have a nice soft blue light in my scene. And I might want to even increase this a little bit, maybe 0.7. So we're getting a nice mood to our lights. Now there's two different things you can do. You can actually turn this light so it doesn't cast any shadows either as well. You can see shadows are actually not on for this. There's no shadows being created. The shadows we see are actually our default shadows. But if I turn shadows on, see, we get those shadows in our scene now. And I can do the same thing for this omni light as well. I'll just go in here and grab it. Shadows on. And this is just using what's called the regular shadow map. So it's doing its best to calculate the shadows how it sees fit. Now this is going to need a lot of different alterations. We're going to have to play around with these lights a lot to make our scene look good. We can change the shadow type if we want. So right now it's using the shadow map. We can use ray trace shadows with our much sharper shadows. We can use aux ray trace, deep shadow maps, etc., etc. But the one important thing I always find in shadows, as you start playing around with them a lot, the one thing you're going to want to have is the difference in intensity of the shadows. Shadows are never really like fully black because normally they're either lit by something else. So when something is creating shadows, like this in our scene right here, and I'm going to put it back to area shadows. Normally what's going to happen is that the shadow intensity is going to be lower. So if I look at intensity, color, this kind of stuff, we can change the type of decay our regular light has, how far that light can go. We can change the advanced effects if it's ambient only, if there needs to be a projection map, meaning it's only shadowed or lit in a certain way. We can actually change the shadow parameters too, which changes the density and the color of the shadow. So if I want to, I can change the density of the shadow to, let's say, 0.5. And then I know that the shadows are actually a lot lighter. You can see these shadows are actually a lot lighter here. And you can change it so that different objects react different ways to light as well. Now you'll notice there's still a lot of dark parts in our scenes. That's because there's no lighting on this side of our object. So it's lit. Our scene is lit a little bit, but there's a lot of really dark spots. And this is why normally in Pixar movies and other things, they'll put tons of lights in their scenes to bounce light around a little bit better. So I would actually add a light here, maybe a spotlight here. That's really light, something like this. And I would change this. No shadows. It's a spot, but I'm actually going to change this color to a bluish type color at a really low intensity. See, even 0.1 is a lot, 0.05 maybe. And see, look, we're getting that mood in. Now we can see a little bit of our model. Start changing it around. There's a little bit of a rim here, which I like. So setting up these lights is definitely going to be really important to get the mood in your scene. We don't expect it to be perfect, so don't worry about getting everything like crazy accurate or glowing or going nuts. This is to set up your basic scene. Don't forget to also layer these lights too. So put these lights, so I have spot 1, spot 2, spot 3 targets all here. I'm going to put them in a new layer called lights. And try and name your lights as accurately as possible. So if this is the light, the first Omni I created, which was a spot, and I switched to an Omni, I would actually call tractor beam light. So then I can always disable or enable it whenever I want to, so I can do some testing. Don't forget I can change the intensity of it. So a couple of small things that you should note as well. If you right-click on an object and go to Object Properties, you can actually change how it reacts to light as well. You can see that I can receive shadows and cast shadows right here. Visible to reflections and refractions or not. So we can actually change this so that the tractor beam does not cast shadows and it does not receive shadows. And then that way, we're not casting a tractor beam shadow anywhere, and it keeps the light going on. So what ideally I'd like to have, and like to see you have, is different layers for the different parts of your scene. So the barn should be one layer. Barn and silo, maybe it should be called like buildings. And then you would render those different parts of the scenes. You can render it all together if you'd like, but I would like those layers still there so I can turn them on and off. I'd like you to play around with lights a lot. Have at least one camera and several lights to light your scene to give it a mood. Put your alien there. Add the details wherever you want. Make sure your models look really good in low and high poly. With just the turbo smooth and mesh smooth. If we have a good scene set up and you send me some really good stuff, then next week we're going to do a high poly version of this scene or an alternate scene to work on detail. So I can show you how to make the barn look like it's made of wood, like wooden planks out of 3D models, that kind of thing. You can already do that if you want by extruding and just trying to fake the look of wooden planks. It will be a bit difficult, but like I said, if you want to go the extra mile, you're only helping yourself. You're not hindering anybody. And we'll teach you more about rendering dynamics afterwards. I'm going to create a video 5B right after this one that will explain a little bit more about how to get certain rendering looks done. And hopefully that will help. Also, be sure to look up other lighting tutorials on YouTube. I am okay at lighting, but there are definitely better people at it. This is a modeling course, so I'm really focusing on the models. But I know if you want to make some pretty renders to show off what you've been doing in class, lighting is definitely a good way to make those happen. I'll give you a couple more suggestions in the 5B video on how to make cool scenes and show off your 3D models a bit. But for now, try and play around with lights and cameras and just have fun with it.